Hello and welcome to this video on the trade-offs between macroeconomic objectives. So Tigers B was an acronym we used early in the term to remember what? That's right, the macroeconomic objectives. So you might want to pause the video at this point in time and just try and remember what are the 7 main macroeconomic objectives of government. Because in this video we're going to look at how it's not always easy for governments to achieve all their objectives at the same time. So we're going to look at some of the basic conflicts between achieving these objectives. There's an important conflict between inflation and unemployment that we need to be able to describe. And then we're going to look at some other conflicts as well. So there are 7 main macroeconomic policy goals or objectives: low unemployment, low inflation, high level of economic growth, balance of payment stability, and then additionally we have to keep the government budget balanced, to achieve a fair and equitable distribution of income and wealth, and lastly to use resources within the economy sustainably and to protect or conserve the environment. And the government achieves these goals or tries to achieve these goals by using the policies that they have available. So they might use fiscal policy, G&T, tax and spending. They might use monetary policy, interest and exchange rates. They might use supply side policies. Now, attempting to meet these objectives through these policy instruments can often involve a bit of a trade-off. And what we mean by that is by pursuing one objective, it can have a negative effect or a negative consequence for another objective. And so a trade-off has to be made as to which one is more important. So if we take the 4 main objectives, then there are 6 combinations potentially between these objectives. And when you throw in the additional objectives as well, we have a lot of different combinations of objectives that need to be met or ideally want to be met at the same time. And we're going to look at some of these and see which ones are compatible with each other, which ones are quite easy to achieve together at the same time, and which ones are not easy to achieve at the same time and are in conflict or incompatible. So we're going to start off by looking at whether low inflation and low unemployment can be achieved at the same time. And this is regarded as a classic trade-off. And the economics or the story behind this goes as follows. So often the government will introduce policies to try and reduce inflation, and these are likely to target and try and reduce AD. For example, a fiscal policy of tax rise, or maybe a monetary policy of an interest rate rise. Now, as a result of lower aggregate demand, firms will reduce output. In addition, firms may invest less. And this scaling back in output may cause some unemployment. So here we have a natural contradiction between trying to reduce inflation but also increase employment. And this relationship is demonstrated by a graph called the Phillips curve, which was first characterized by an economist, Phillips, in the 1950s. And his findings pose a bit of a challenge to government. And the challenge is how can they meet both these objectives at the same time? So here is some of the analysis that was done by Phillips, and this is his Phillips curve. So what Phillips did was he took data, and this example here, data has come from 1861 to 1913, and he looked in over that time period at the rate of change of wages in the economy in that year, which he used as a kind of measure for inflation. And he looked at the rate of unemployment in the economy in that year. And so these black dots here represent individual years over this time period. And so, for example, this black dot here represents a year in which unemployment was just under 7%, and the rate of inflation was actually very low, deflation of nearly 2%. And once he plotted out all these years and the data from all these years, he looked at the line of best fit, and he found that there was this curve that fitted the plots that he had, fitted the points that he had plotted. And what this curve showed was that as governments try and reduce inflation, it seems that unemployment increases. Or as governments try and reduce unemployment, it seems that inflation increases. So actually achieving a period of low inflation and low unemployment is very difficult to achieve. And this relationship is known as the Phillips curve. And so it's based on a scatter graph of unemployment and inflation. Phillips extended his analysis and eventually completed in 1958 and took data over a long period of time. And it told the government what unemployment would be if a level of inflation was achieved. In the 1970s, this analysis seemed to break down a little bit when the curve shifted upwards and unemployment was associated with higher levels of inflation, a concept or phenomenon we know as stagflation. So here is our illustration of the short-run Phillips curve. So this is what we should have down in our notes, this sort of diagram. And let's have a quick explanation of how this theory works. We're going to imagine that the desired rate of inflation is 2%, P1, and the desired rate of unemployment is 4%, and we're going to say that's U3. Now, let's imagine we're in an economy where we have the desired rate of inflation, 2%, but we have high levels of unemployment. In this position, are we meeting both of our objectives? No, we're meeting the inflation objective, but not the unemployment objective. Now, what might the government do to solve that? Well, they might want to increase aggregate demand within the economy. They might cut taxes or lower interest rates. And as AD increases, output increases, and unemployment we would expect would start to decrease. But also if we think about it, as aggregate demand increases, that's going to put pressures on prices in the economy, and so inflation will start to rise. And so eventually we might find that the increase in aggregate demand has met our unemployment target and we're back to 4% unemployment. But actually there's been a trade-off and inflation is now way above target at P3. And the converse is also true, that if we're at a high level of inflation, P3, the government might want to reduce aggregate demand to try and bring inflation back towards a target of 2%. But a trade-off here would be that that reduction in aggregate demand would likely increase unemployment as less is being produced. So achieving this sweet spot here of low inflation and low unemployment is very difficult. We can move towards it, but then we always drift away and there's a trade-off in terms of the other objective. Right, let's move on now to our second combination of objectives, low inflation and high economic growth. This is similar to the relationship between inflation and unemployment. If AD is increased to tackle inflation, then we would expect to see a fall in consumption and investment. The rate of economic growth is likely to fall too as firms reduce their production levels, thus reducing GDP and slowing down the economy. So we would say that these are incompatible. It's hard for the government to control or have lower inflation and at the same time be boosting the economy so that we get higher economic growth. Our third pair of objectives is low inflation and a stable balance of payments. Now, this might be compatible because if by reducing aggregate demand to control inflation, this might make UK-based prices more competitive because the price level in the UK is lower. This may increase demand for UK exports and result in removing away a current account deficit, which would mean it would be compatible, or maybe creating a current account surplus, which, whilst not technically the objective, would still potentially maybe be desirable. On the flip side, if there is control of inflation using an increase in interest rates, so raising interest rates, this may actually lead to a stronger pound due to hot money flows, and the stronger pound would make UK exports more expensive and therefore less attractive. So this may be incompatible. So really, this one is a it depends. Okay, number 4 is the comparison between the objectives of high economic growth and stable balance of payments. Now, initially we might think that this is incompatible because economic growth leads to higher living standards, greater income levels. And if there's a high income elasticity of demand for imports, then economic growth will suck in more imports, worsen the current account deficit, making it incompatible with balance of payment stability. However, on the flip side, if economic growth has come about from a more efficient, productive economy with better quality, more competitive goods, then there may be an increase in demand for UK exports and a switch towards UK-produced goods and move away from imports. So therefore, there might well be compatibility between the two objectives. So again, this one is a depends. Okay, number 5 is low unemployment and high economic growth. Well, an expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy to try and tackle low economic growth and increase the level of economic growth would also see more being produced and that should result in more employment. So we would say that these are likely to be compatible objectives. Our final one of the big four is unemployment and balance of payments. This could be compatible if low levels of unemployment are achieved by policies on the supply side, which act as an incentive for the unemployed to take low-paid work, which maybe reduce costs, making UK goods more competitive. On the flip side, if a reduction in unemployment results in an increase in income, and this higher income results in more imports, then this could worsen it. So this is a depends. Okay, there's a couple more here with some of the additional objectives, and this first one is economic growth and sustainability. This is quite a nice one to be able to use. And we say that economic growth often involves producing more. And if the production of these goods and services involves using up finite resources, such as oil and gas, then these objectives are in conflict because we're not sustainably using the resources in the economy. However, it could be noted that if the growth has come from services rather than manufactured goods, then the impact on the environment might not be that significant. But generally speaking, we would say that these objectives tend to be incompatible. The higher the rate of economic growth, the less environmental protection or the less resources are being used sustainably. And one other additional one to be aware of is economic growth and a more equal income distribution. And this one really depends. It could be incompatible, as an increase in economic growth may be inconsistent with an equal distribution of income, because having very rich people and very poor people creates an incentive to work hard, improving productivity and encouraging people to be more entrepreneurial. Also, very rich people, individuals, can provide the capital to set up new businesses. So economic growth might lead to a less equal income distribution. On the flip side, you might say they're incompatible because if there are high levels of relative poverty and an unequal distribution of income, this can reduce consumption in the economy. This is particularly the case because low-income households tend to spend a greater proportion of their incomes, whilst higher income households tend to save more. So again, this one really depends. So in summary, this is a nice depiction of whether the objectives are easy to achieve at the same time, they're compatible in green, whether it's difficult for governments to achieve them at the same time, in which they're red. The ones in yellow is a bit, it depends to what exactly is happening within the economy as to whether both these objectives can be seen achieved at the same time. So in this video, we've looked at the basic conflicts between objectives, particularly focusing on the Phillips curve, and then we've looked at some of the other conflicts between objectives as well and looked to explain those. That's it. Thank you very much.